Welcome to Trainsignal. You're watching an introduction to Active Directory. In this lesson, we're going to start off by defining exactly what Active Directory is. Then we'll look at some of the benefits of using Active Directory. We'll look at the structure that makes up the Active Directory database. We'll go through and define each of the individual Active Directory components. We'll talk briefly about domain and forest functional levels, although that is something we're going to get into in more detail in a later lesson. And then we'll talk just a little bit about something called trust and trust relationships that exist within Active Directory. So to get things started, well, what is Active Directory? Well, on the screen, I have a definition that actually comes straight from Microsoft. And what this says is it says Active Directory Domain Services. And we're going to have our focus right now on those domain services. And I'll explain that more in just a minute. But Active Directory Domain Services and its related services form the foundation for enterprise networks running Microsoft Windows, as together they act as tools to store information about the identities of users, computers, and services, to authenticate a user or computer, and to provide a mechanism with which the user or computer can access a resource in the enterprise. Now, like I said, that's the actual definition straight from Microsoft, but basically Active Directory or directory services as a whole. Now remember here, I said we're focusing on the Active Directory domain services, and I'll explain that again in just a moment, but directory services as a whole is kind of the underlying foundation to how networks work. Okay, I mean, technically a network can work by just having two computers talking to each other and sharing resources. But in the actual enterprise environment, we need to be more productive than just having a bunch of computers that share stuff with each other. We have to have some kind of centralized database or central repository of information. And maybe even we could say central control of that information. Well, that's what Active Directory Domain Services is. Now, why do I keep putting the emphasis on domain services? Well, you'll notice here at the bottom of the screen, in Windows Server 2008, Active Directory is now made up of 5 services. The top one I have listed is Active Directory Domain Services, or ADDS. And I will tell you that the majority of this course is going to be focused on Active Directory Domain Services. But technically, Active Directory, if we just use that generic term, although we're usually referring to the domain services, it now includes 4 additional services, those being lightweight directory services, certificate services, rights management services, and federation services. Now we'll get into more detail about what each of those additional 4 services are much later in this course. I have individual lessons for each one of those. But basically what I can tell you is that all of those services did previously exist. They just weren't part of Active Directory. They were each a component in of their self. Matter of fact, the closest thing I would say is, I suppose, lightweight directory services. It was kind of associated with Active Directory in the past. But for the most part, these were all separate services. They were all separate beasts on their own. And now Microsoft has brought them all together in Active Directory. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Remember, Active Directory Domain Services is what we're going to talk about for the majority of this course. And then near the end, I'll go ahead and give you a lesson on each one of the 4 additional Active Directory services which are now available. So you might be thinking to yourself, I went and got this course to learn about Active Directory, and maybe you're looking to get certified in Active Directory, and you keep hearing all this about Active Directory this, Active Directory that, something we have to have. But you might be thinking, well, why? Well, I started to mention some of that why just a few moments ago. And basically, without Active Directory, we really have no structure to our network. Okay, so I suppose the overall underlying benefit of Active Directory is to give structure to your network. Now, I will tell you that if I was to try to list out literal benefits of Active Directory, that list would be way longer than anything that could fit on the screen. I could probably use up pages and pages of bullet points with all the different benefits of Active Directory. But just to mention a few high-level benefits, well, first of all, we have centralized management. Okay, and that's what I've been talking about all along. By adding that structure to your network, you now have a central management point to keep things in order. Now, another big benefit is the use of what's called single sign-on. Instead of users having to enter their credentials every time they want to access a resource. And by the way, if you're thinking, well, Ed, you keep saying share resources and resources. Resources are files and folders and printers and just anything that you would access on a computer network. Well, without Active Directory, a user would have to enter their credentials every time they go to access a resource. With Active Directory, they sign on once. They enter their username and password once, and then they just go ahead and access all the resources that they have permissions to get to. Now, that kind of leads into the next bullet point I have here, which is simplified access to resources. And, well, one simplification is what I just mentioned, the fact that you don't have to keep entering your credentials. But another reason that we have simplified access to resources is that Active Directory can be used to help locate resources around the network. Another benefit to Active Directory is stronger security, and that really comes along with the centralized management. If you have decentralized management, if every computer is just kind of managed in place, and so basically every user is administrator of their own machine, and everybody has to then try to coordinate with everybody else, etc., well, that's not very good security. When you have everything centralized, it's all managed from one central location, you have much stronger security. And along with stronger security, you also have standardized administration because, again, it's all centralized. Now, I will mention that the standardized administration is not just because everything is centralized, but you can actually decentralize certain things. As we'll see when we go through this course, we can decentralize certain aspects of administration, but have control over it from Active Directory, from that centralized management point. And the last bullet point I have here is simplified deployment. Now, this is going to greatly depend on how you want to utilize Active Directory, but as you will see later on in this course, you can push down software and things like that from Active Directory. You can modify users' desktop environment from Active Directory. So what that means is when you go out and deploy a computer to one of your clients, you don't necessarily have to go through and configure every last little component of that computer. Some of that will be managed from Active Directory. So, as I said, I could go on. This list could just go on and on and on. I could break it down into individual detailed bullet points. But I just wanted you to get the general idea of why we want to use Active Directory, other than just, well, my boss says we use it. Because that's, to be honest with you, many people I come across, that's all they know is, well, I took a job at this company and I'm the IT administrator and, well, we have Active Directory, so I got to learn it. But I don't have any real idea why. Well, now you do. So now if we take a look at the Active Directory database itself, the Active Directory database is divided into many different partitions. Now I've broken down 5 of these potential partitions here on the screen. But there is the ability to have additional partitions beyond just what you see here. And actually, I'll get specific with that as we go through these. Now, first of all, let's go ahead and start off with the schema and the configuration partition. Those are 2 absolute partitions. Okay, what I mean by that is every single Active Directory database is going to have a schema. And the schema, which we'll talk about in just a moment, is the definition of the makeup of all objects within the database. Okay, it's kind of a blueprint, so to speak, of the database. Well, that blueprint is stored in the schema partition of the database. The configuration partition is another absolute partition, and in every instance of Active Directory, this partition exists to show the overall structure of your Active Directory environment. Now, some of this, if you've never worked with Active Directory before, is probably sounding a little bit confusing. And I promise you, even before we're done with this one lesson, it's going to all make a lot more sense, because we're going to go through and look at each one of these components that make up an Active Directory infrastructure, and it's all of those components together that make up the configuration that you'll find in the configuration partition. Now, the domain partition is sort of an absolute. And what I mean by that is there will always be the domain partition. But in an Active Directory infrastructure, you can have more than one domain. Now, we haven't even talked about what a domain is yet, so I will define that for you a little more clearly in just a few minutes. But for right now, just understand that there can be more than one domain, and what this partition contains is all of the domain-specific information. So it's an absolute in the sense that it always exists, but it may not be one partition. There may be 3 domain partitions if there are 3 domains in your Active Directory infrastructure. Now, the next partition that I have listed is the DNS partition, and you'll notice that I've also said that this is sometimes referred to as an application partition. And the reason why is because there are a variety of what's called Active Directory integrated applications, each of which may possibly utilize its own partition in the database. And DNS, which we'll talk about in detail in the very next lesson, but in DNS, if it's going to be what's called Active Directory integrated DNS, there is a partition in the database that is set aside specifically for that DNS information. Now, the last partition that I've listed here is the global catalog, or what's sometimes referred to as the partial attribute set. And the reason it's referred to as the partial attribute set is because, well, that's exactly what the global catalog is. Again, we'll talk about this in just a few minutes, but the global catalog is a subset of the attributes of every object within your Active Directory database. So the reality is everything that is in the global catalog partition to some extent is also in one of the domain partitions, where those domain objects actually exist. Now, when we talk about the global catalog in more detail, this will make a lot more sense. But I just want you to get the idea that this database is divided into these different partitions. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, so what? So there's a database and it's divided, and why do I care? Well, the reason you care is because when it comes to replication, which again is another topic, in fact, we'll have pretty much almost a whole lesson about replication, but when it comes to replicating this database from one place to another, because this database will exist in more than one place on your network if everything is set up correctly, when it's replicating, when a change is made and that change needs to be replicated, you will see how we can have better control over that replication by controlling which partitions are being replicated. Now let's take a look at the actual Active Directory components. Okay, I'm going to go through each one of these and define them for you. We're going to talk about exactly what a domain is, a tree, a forest, an organizational unit, domain controller, site, schema, and global catalog. Recognize any of those names? I can already see at least 3 that have been mentioned so far in this lesson. So let's go through and define those now. First of all, what is a domain? Now, one thing I need to tell you before we talk about exactly what a domain is I have to tell you that if you've studied Active Directory before now, you may have seen different definitions of what a domain is. And it's not that those definitions are wrong and mine's right, or that that mine's wrong and they're right or anything like that. It's that the definition of what a domain is has changed over the years since Active Directory was originally rolled out with Windows 2000. And as a matter of fact, domains themselves existed before Active Directory. Okay, domains were part of directory services even back in the days of Windows NT. So a domain, as far as what it is now in Windows Server 2008, it's really actually quite simplified. It's the core administrative unit of Active Directory. Okay, so you will see as we go through that there are different levels of where things can be stored. So we may refer to a domain as being a container because it stores things, and where things can be managed. And that's what I mean by the administrative unit, because things within the domain can be managed. Now, you may have seen a definition that talks about a domain being a security boundary. Well, that has changed. It's not really considered to be a security boundary because a lot of the security that we used to keep contained within a domain, well, is no longer contained. Matter of fact, it never really was contained within the domain. It was thought to have been contained. It is the core administrative unit. Now, another definition you might see, and this one actually is still accurate, is that a domain is a unit of replication. That is not false. A domain is a unit of replication. Why? Well, let's go back and take a look. Remember our partitions to the database? Well, all domain controllers, which again, there I go with a term that I haven't defined yet, but I'm using it. All domain controllers within a domain are going to replicate the domain partition, but they will not replicate that information with domain controllers from a different domain. Only things like the schema and configuration would necessarily be replicated between all domain controllers regardless of domain. So you kind of have some level of control over how much is being replicated by doing nothing more than separating into another domain. Now, this again is something that we're going to talk about in much more detail as we get deeper into this course. But I just want you to have the general idea that when we talk about a domain, it's the core administrative unit of Active Directory. And on the screen, you might be thinking to yourself, well, why is there this big blue triangle? Well, this big blue triangle is a representation of a domain. The triangle is the universal symbol for a domain. And when you see different charts, different network diagrams showing domains within Active Directory, they should be represented as triangles. They're not always. I have seen circles and things like that, but they should be triangles. And then the name that I have here, globalmantics.local, is of course the first domain that we will be creating in this course. So what is a tree? A tree is made up of one or more domains, but there is something specific about those domains, because you can just have a bunch of domains. They don't have to be part of a tree. What makes them part of a tree is that they share contiguous DNS namespace. Now, what does that mean, sharing contiguous DNS namespace? Well, what it means is that these domains will be set up in a form of a hierarchy. So here we have our globalmantics.local domain up top. And then we have within the tree child domains. Okay, so they are lower branches. And when you go down to a child domain, it will share that globalmantics.local namespace. Okay, that's the DNS namespace that is contiguous. What makes this a separate domain is that this is the Asia.globalmantics.local or the NA for North America.globalmantics.local domain. Okay, so on the screen here is a diagram of an Active Directory tree because it's 3 domains that share contiguous namespace. So if we know what a tree is, well, then what is a forest? All right. Well, if you forget about technology, forget that you're even watching this course. If I just walked up to you in the street and I had a microphone in my hand and I was just doing an interview and I said, "Hey, what's a forest?" Well, your answer would probably be, well, it's a bunch of trees, right? Well, guess what? That's what a forest is within Active Directory. A forest is one or more trees making up a single instance of Active Directory. So one thing I do want to clarify is that a forest is one or more trees. I mean, that's to make it real simple. It's one or more trees. But it is not, and I really want to emphasize this because I have seen this misrepresented. It is not your entire Active Directory. It's not made up of every domain in your organization. It is a single instance of Active Directory, and in many organizations, it is every domain within that organization. Okay, there are many enterprises out there that only have a single Active Directory forest. But there are also enterprises out there that have more than one Active Directory forest. And I will tell you, by the way, that a forest is considered to be both a security and replication boundary. Now, as far as the security boundary, I mentioned that a few moments ago, that's what we used to call a domain. Well, that's what we now call a forest. It is truly a security boundary. By default, nobody from one Active Directory forest is going to be able to access anything from another person's Active Directory forest. By default. That can be changed. There can be some level of control put in to allow information to be shared between forests. And again, this is stuff that's going to come in much more detail as we go through the course. But the other thing I want to define is that here I'm saying replication boundary, and this is a little bit different of a replication boundary than the way I defined the domain being a replication boundary. This is a more absolute replication boundary. In other words, nothing is replicated from one forest to another. The entire Active Directory database exists within its own forest. None of it is replicated to another forest. Now again, as always, there are certain exceptions to the rule, and there are certain configurations that can be put in place to where, and in this case it's going to be very, very, very small components, but there are small components that can be replicated between forests if they are set up to do so. But otherwise, by default, that entire Active Directory database is always contained and replicated within a forest. So on the screen here, you'll see that I have the original tree that was created with our globalmantics.local and the child domains of North America and Asia.globalmantics.local. But then you'll also notice that I have Trainsignal.local and then Chicago.Trainsignal.local. Now you may also notice that there are these lines that are drawn between the parent of each tree, this being one tree over here and this being another tree over here. But there's also a line going from the parent of each of those trees to each other. I will explain what those lines are in just a little bit. But this diagram, the way you see it here, this is set up as a single forest with two different trees. So now we need to talk about these things called organizational units, or sometimes just simply referred to as OUs, because organizational unit is a mouthful if you have to say it a lot. So basically, to understand organizational units, everything in Active Directory, so all things contained within Active Directory are called objects. Okay, we have all these objects within the Active Directory database. An organizational unit is a container for those objects. Now, besides OUs, there are also some built-in containers. And when we get to the actual operating system itself, when we get in a couple lessons from now and we go in and install Active Directory, I will show you these built-in containers. And then I'll also be, of course, be showing you how to create additional OUs. Now, besides certain built-in containers that are similar to OUs, we also have the domain itself, which is a form of a built-in container, right? A domain is a container. It's the highest level of container, so to speak. It's the core administrative unit. It's the core container. Okay, so you're going to want to understand that concept, the concept of containers and then objects within those containers. And I promise you, if you're confused at all right now, it will all make sense once we get into the operating system and look at it. But over here on the right, I have a picture of one of my domains that I had set up for globalmantics.local and some of the containers. So you'll notice, for instance, here we have client computers. And inside of that, there's a hierarchical fashion to this. I've got the different locations, Chicago, Dallas, New York, and Tokyo. So that's maybe where the client computer objects would be stored for each of those locations. You'll notice here, there is the computers container. That's a built-in container. And again, we're going to talk about this in more detail, but that is where computers will go by default, or computer objects will go by default, if you don't specify where they need to go. So it really all comes down to how specific you want to get with things like that. Likewise, you'll see here we have user accounts. We've got that broken down into Chicago, Dallas, New York, and Tokyo. And then to take that a step further, I've shown you, and now each of these locations could be expanded, but I only expanded the one here for New York to show you that we're going to go ahead and break those users down into our contractors versus our full-time users versus our part-time users. And then again, you'll notice here's that users container built in. So we'll come back to this in much more detail when we get into the operating system, but an organizational unit is a container. Now, OUs serve three main purposes. One, well, just flat out keep objects organized, right? You can see from the way I have everything structured on the right, well, this is just a matter of organizing our objects, making them easy to find, or at least in a sensible location. But another purpose to our OUs is for the delegation of administrative permissions. In other words, I'd mentioned that the domain is the core administrative unit. Well, as we'll learn in a later lesson, we can break down those administrative permissions, delegate them out to different people over different areas of our network. So as a for instance, maybe I have a local IT person in the Chicago office who is responsible for desktop support for the Chicago computers. Well, then I may go ahead and delegate some appropriate permissions to that administrator over the Chicago OU container. And then, of course, all the objects inside of it. Now, the third purpose to OUs is for the managing of group policy application. There I go, throwing another term out there that we haven't talked about. You'll see later in this course, I have a series of lessons that are going to be all about something called group policy. Group policy is how we keep control over our environment. Well, you will learn that these group policies are applied at different levels in the Active Directory hierarchy, one of those levels being the organizational unit level. So again, maybe there are some settings that I want to have in place specifically on all the client computers in the Chicago office. Well, again, group policy may be applied to that Chicago client computer OU. Now, I don't want you to fret over any of this because I'm really kind of throwing a ton at you all at once. We are going to come back and revisit all of this in detail as we go through this course. Aha, here's a term I've already mentioned, domain controller. What is a domain controller? A domain controller is a server which has the Active Directory domain services role installed and hosts the Active Directory database. Okay, so the shorter version is, well, these are the computers that have the Active Directory on them. That's the short answer. Domain controller is a computer that has Active Directory on it. Okay, these are the computers that have the Active Directory database. And when we talk about replicating from one domain controller to another, and certain partitions may replicate and others don't, well, this is what I'm talking about. Here I have a couple of different servers, both of which have Active Directory installed and have the database stored on their local hard drives. And maybe these two servers are both part of the same domain. Well, then guess what? This domain partition is going to have to be replicated between these two domain controllers. Now, again, don't get caught up with all the replication talk and stuff like that. Got a whole lesson on that. Well, speaking of replication, now that I told you don't worry about it, we need to talk about what a site is. Well, a site is an Active Directory object that represents a well-connected portion of your network. A site, if all of the computers are going to be part of a site, and technically, by the way, a site is an object. It's called a site object within Active Directory. That means that all of those computers are part of a high-speed network connection. So the example that I've given here is we have our New York site and our Chicago site. And all the computers within the New York site, or we could say the New York location, that's another term we could use for site, is it's a location, so to speak. They are all on a high-speed local area network. And then we have the Chicago site, and all of those computers are on a high-speed local area network. And then we have a slower, and I'm going to say slower as opposed to slow, WAN connection between the two offices. Now, the reason I'm going to say slower is because these days, many of the WAN connections are considered to be high-speed WAN connections, right? How many companies out there are advertising high-speed internet? And what is high-speed internet? 6 megabits per second? 12 megabits per second? 24 megabits per second? Well, guess what? Even at those speeds, although that may be fast for the internet, that's not fast compared to a local area network, which on the slow end is going to be functioning at 100 megabits per second. And these days, very often, could be functioning at gigabit, where we have a gigabit per second type speeds. So that's why I'm putting the emphasis on slower, is because I don't want you to get confused when you see something that says, oh, we have a high-speed connection between the offices. Yes, it may be high speed, but it's slower. Now, we're going to talk about this in great detail. There's a whole lesson just on sites and replication. But the idea here is that this is your true unit of replication. A site is really what we create to have absolute control over replication, because all of the information will be replicated very quickly within the New York site, between all the domain controllers within the New York site. And all the information will be replicated very quickly. And when I say very quickly, we're talking sometimes within moments and certainly within a matter of minutes. There's kind of a long, detailed explanation behind this, but pretty much everything is replicated to all domain controllers hosting the databases within a site in a maximum of 15 minutes within a site. But between the two sites, what we're going to do is we're going to designate a specific domain controller from each site who is going to communicate with the domain controller from the other site and replicate information on a controlled basis. We can control what time and how often that information is replicated. Okay, so once again, throwing a lot of high-level, somewhat confusing information that I promise you I'm going to cover in more detail in a later lesson. So what is a schema? Well, the schema defines all the objects and attributes that Active Directory uses to store data. Okay, so when I said it's kind of like a blueprint of information? Well, it's the structure. Okay, the schema is kind of the structure of the database. It's what defines that a user object, as a for instance, has a first name and a last name and a password and a department and a phone number, etc., etc., etc. All of those attributes, which we'll see when we get into the operating system, that a user object contains, well, that is defined by the schema. Now, certain Active Directory integrated applications may modify the schema. One real obvious example would be Microsoft Exchange Server. We are at a point now that Exchange Server requires Active Directory for it to work. And the reason why is because Exchange no longer has its own directory services. It participates in Active Directory services. And it does this by modifying the schema. And the examples would be, well, if we're going to have Exchange, a user account would have to have certain specific attributes that are going to relate to that user's email address and that user's interaction with the Exchange server. So that's why the schema would then have to be modified. Now, one thing that I'm going to tell you is that although the schema can be modified manually, I recommend that you don't do it. Okay, unless you know exactly what you're doing and unless you're leaning kind of on the side of the developer side of things, don't go in and mess around with the schema. Just leave it alone. The schema should primarily only be modified through basically programmatic interaction. In other words, a developer will write a program that's going to interact with Active Directory, and as part of that interaction, it will modify the schema. If the schema were to become corrupt, then your Active Directory infrastructure, for all intents and purposes, ceases to exist. And that's why I'm putting such an emphasis on the fact that you just don't want to be messing with this thing. Now, the last component that I want to define for you here is the global catalog. What is the global catalog? Well, it is a partial attribute set, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, of every object within the Active Directory forest. And here's the deal. What is the global catalog's purpose? I mean, why do we want to do that? I mean, the objects already exist somewhere else. Why do we want to have this thing called the global catalog? Well, I mentioned that the domain partition is only going to be replicated to domain controllers within that domain. Well, what if a user in one domain needs to reference an Active Directory object that's in another domain? The way it finds that object is through the global catalog. This partial attribute set, the subset of attributes, are the ones that are used primarily for searching, for the locating of objects. So the global catalog is a form of index, so to speak. It indexes everything in the forest so that anything that needs to be found can be found from anywhere. Now, we'll talk in much more detail about the placement of what's called global catalog servers, which are also domain controllers, but not all domain controllers are global catalog servers. Certain domain controllers will also be designated as global catalog servers, and we will talk in great detail about the importance of the placement of those servers. All right, so now that we have all of the different components defined, I want to talk to you briefly about something here called domain and forest functional levels. And I say briefly because we are going to talk about this in more detail in upcoming lessons. Okay, there are many different things that we're going to talk about as we go through the course that are going to relate to a certain domain or forest functional level. So I want to give you the basic underlying concept of what this is right now. The functional level of a domain or forest determines what new features and functionality will be available. Okay, so the concept here is, first we had Active Directory in Windows 2000. Then we had Active Directory in Windows Server 2003. And that new version, that new updated version of Active Directory came with some new features and functionality. The problem is that Windows 2000 domain controllers won't understand those features or functionality. It won't know what to do with it. So what we need to do is we need to keep the functional level in a place that lets Active Directory know that there are still Windows 2000 domain controllers out there, and take away some of those new features and functions that they won't understand. And then now we have Windows Server 2008, which has even more new features and functionality, which not only are Windows 2000 domain controllers not going to understand, but the Windows Server 2003 domain controllers are not going to understand. Now we have functional levels broken down at both the forest and domain level. The forest functional levels, there's two levels. There's Windows Server 2003 and Windows Server 2008. And basically, you need to be in the Windows Server 2003 functional level if you still have any Windows Server 2003 or older domain controllers. We have three domain functional levels: Windows 2000 native, Windows Server 2003, and Windows Server 2008. And basically, that is just a more detailed breakdown of if you still have any Windows 2000 domain controllers laying around, then you have to be in Windows 2000 native. If you have Windows Server 2003, but you don't have any Windows 2000 domain controllers, then you need to be in the domain functional level of Windows Server 2003. And only when you have exclusive Windows Server 2008 domain controllers can you raise a domain functional level to Windows Server 2008. Now, I'm also going to tell you that you will see when we get into the operating system that this is not 100% accurate anymore. With the release of R2, there's actually a separate functional level for Windows Server 2008 R2. But let's not worry about that for right now. Let's keep it real simple. Keep it with just these three functional levels. I'll show it to you when we get into the actual operating system. Now, as I've been mentioning all along, all domain controllers in a domain must be running the appropriate version of Windows before the functional level can be raised. If I still have a Windows 2000 domain controller and I raise my forest functional level, or we'll even just say our domain functional level, to Windows Server 2008, we're going to have problems. And the reason we're going to have problems is because the Windows 2000 domain controllers aren't going to know how to communicate properly with the Windows Server 2008 domain controllers, because they're going to have functionality that the Windows 2000 domain controllers are just going to be scratching their head going, huh? What is that? Now, the other thing you need to know is that all domain functional levels must be raised before the forest functional level can be raised. And the one last thing I want to tell you here is that once a functional level has been raised, it cannot be lowered. So please keep that in mind, that you want to be careful. Only raise the functional level, not just when you know, okay, well, all my domain controllers are at this certain level of operating system, but that I'm not going to be bringing in any domain controllers on a prior operating system. Okay, that's really important, because once you've raised it, it cannot go back down. Oh, and one other thing I'll mention is you may have noticed that I keep saying domain controllers, domain controllers, domain controllers. It's only the domain controllers that matter. You don't have to worry about your clients or your member servers. Only the domain controllers have to be at the appropriate version of Windows for the functional level to be raised, because it's only about Active Directory functionality that we're worrying about. So the member servers and our clients can be on any operating system, on any domain or forest functional level. All right, now the last thing I want to talk to you about before we wrap this lesson up is I want to talk to you about this thing called trust and trust relationships. Now, a trust relationship is what allows users from one domain to access resources from another domain. Now, this is why domains used to be considered a security boundary, is because we used to say that users pretty much could only get to stuff within their own domain. Well, that was like I said before, never really true, and now is definitely not true. And the reason why is because all domains within a forest trust each other by default. So, you remember these lines that were drawn between the parent and the child domains in a tree? And I said I'd explain what those lines were. Well, now you'll notice that those lines have arrows on them. And the reason they have arrows on them is because that's how you distinguish trust. And there's a significance to the arrow, which I'm going to explain to you here. First of all, because the arrow goes both ways, right? We have an arrow here and we have an arrow here. That means it's a two-way trust. Okay, that means that globalmantics.local trusts NorthAmerica.globalmantics.local, and NorthAmerica.globalmantics.local trusts globalmantics.local. Okay, so it's a two-way trust. It's also what's known as a transitive trust. Transitive means that because globalmantics trusts North America and Asia trusts globalmantics, well, through transition, what that means is, although you don't see anything drawn on the diagram here, through transition, Asia actually trusts North America. Okay, and that's what we mean by transitive trust. Okay, so by default, all parent domains within a tree have a two-way transitive trust relationship with their children domains. And although I don't have it drawn here, if we go back to our other drawing where we had our second tree, kind of a goofy triangle there we go, our second tree, you might remember that there was a line going right here. Well, that line, if I were to add arrows to it, is by default there is a two-way transitive trust relationship between the root of every tree. Now that's a new term, the root of every tree. The first domain in a tree, that top domain, that parent domain, is what's known as the root of that tree. The root of each tree has a two-way transitive trust relationship with the root of other trees. And to be even more specific, the first domain created in the forest is what's known as the forest root domain. And it's that domain that has the two-way transitive trust relationship with the root of every other tree. Now let me get our other tree back out of there again. But that's why all domains within a forest trust all other domains. Now, you remember when I said that a forest is our actual security boundary? But that we can tweak that, we can make changes to that? Well, in order to do that, if we had another domain, and here I just have it listed as external domain. We'll just say it's domain from some other forest. What you can do is you can manually create a trust relationship between that domain and a domain within your forest. Now you'll notice in this case it's a one-way trust. The arrow is only pointing in one direction. What that means is, if you can picture, right now I want you to picture that you're looking at somebody and you're pointing your finger at them. Reach out your arm right now and just point. Point at an imaginary person. Or if there's someone in the room, point at that person. And they'll be sitting there looking at you going, why are you pointing at me? Point at that person and say, I trust you. And the reason I want you to do that is because that's what's happening here. This domain is pointing at this domain, saying, I trust you. When you see a diagram that has an arrow pointing one direction, it means one domain trusts the other. So that means this domain is trusting, right? If I trust you, I'm trusting you. And the domain that's being pointed at is the trusted domain. These are proper names, trusted domain and trusting domain. You need to know what these are, those names, trusted and trusting. Okay, so the way it works is the trusting domain trusts the users from the trusted domain. I trust you to access my stuff. Okay, that's the way I want you to think of it. I trust you to access my stuff. In this diagram, users, that would be the you, I'm trusting you, users in the asia.globalmantics.local domain can access resources from this external domain because the external domain trusts the Asia domain. So that's pretty much how trust relationships work. Trust is all about users in one location, users in one domain, accessing resources from another domain. All right, so that pretty much takes us to the end of this lesson. And, well, let's see, what we talk about? Well, we start off by defining exactly what is Active Directory. And as I mentioned, primarily when we think Active Directory, we are thinking of what's officially called Active Directory Domain Services. Because as we will see much later in this course, we also have 4 other forms of Active Directory services available in Windows Server 2008. We went over some of the benefits of Active Directory, of which the benefits are limitless, but we talked about some of the high-level benefits like centralized management, improved security, single sign-on, stuff like that. Took a look at the Active Directory database and how it's broken down into different partitions, and we will definitely be revisiting that, especially when we talk about replication in future lessons, because that replication has a very direct, or really I should say are directly impacted by those partitions. I went through all the individual Active Directory components, forests, trees, domains, domain controllers, sites, etc., etc. We talked about functional levels, and again, I don't want you to get too caught up on that. That was just kind of a high-level overview of the concept, because as we go through different lessons in this course, we may come across these things called functional levels, so I want you to know what they are. And finally, we talked about what is a trust relationship. And of course, a trust relationship is what allows users from one domain to access resources in another domain. So that is pretty much everything I have for you in this lesson. I will see you in the next one.